Rhett McMillan stood before the floor-length mirror in the groom's suite, adjusting his platinum cufflinks with the satisfied smile of a man who had just pulled off the greatest con of his life. The cufflinks had cost $12,000, a gift to himself for reaching this moment. Each one featured a small diamond surrounded by white gold, the kind of understated luxury that announced wealth without screaming it. Rhett had learned early that true power whispered rather than shouted, and he had spent 32 years perfecting the whisper. In exactly 47 minutes, he would walk down the aisle of the Hartwell estate and marry Willow Holmes, a woman so desperately in love with him that she had never once questioned his motives. She had accepted his whirlwind courtship without suspicion. She had embraced his extravagant proposal without wondering why a man of his status would choose someone so far beneath him. She had agreed enthusiastically when he insisted they didn't need a prenuptial agreement, believing his explanation that their love was too pure and eternal for such cynical legal protections. She had believed every single lie he had ever told her, and there had been hundreds. Rhett poured himself a glass of 18-year scotch from the crystal decanter provided by the venue, savoring the amber liquid's complex aroma before raising it toward his reflection. The Armani tuxedo fit like a second skin, tailored by the same craftsman who dressed European royalty, every seam designed to emphasize his athletic build and disguise the softness that years of inherited wealth had created around his midsection. "To the easiest mark I've ever played," he murmured, draining the glass in one smooth motion and feeling the expensive burn slide down his throat. The plan had been perfect from the beginning, conceived during a moment of desperation and refined over months of careful execution. His father, Vance Turner, had structured the family trust with infuriating conditions that seemed designed specifically to control Rhett's behavior from beyond the boundaries of their contentious relationship. The old man didn't trust his only son, and he had good reason for that distrust, but his solution had been to create a financial labyrinth that required specific behaviors before releasing specific rewards. Rhett couldn't access the next $30 million until he married, and the marriage had to last at least 6 months to satisfy the lawyers who guarded the Turner fortune like territorial dogs protecting a bone. The conditions were spelled out in excruciating detail across 47 pages of legal documentation. Marriage, 6 months minimum, proof of cohabitation, evidence of genuine commitment. But Rhett had no intention of staying married to Willow Holmes for 6 months. He had no intention of staying married to her for 6 weeks. He barely intended to stay married to her for 6 days. The ceremony today wasn't even legally binding, though Willow would never know that until it was far too late to matter. The officiant was an actor named Gerald Hoffman, who owed Rhett nearly $50,000 for gambling debts accumulated over 3 years of increasingly desperate wagers. Gerald had been only too happy to play the role of ordained minister in exchange for having those debts forgiven and receiving an additional $10,000 in cash. The marriage license Willow had signed so happily, tears of joy streaming down her face as she added her name to what she believed was a legally binding document, was a masterfully forged creation that would never see the inside of a county clerk's office. Rhett had paid a specialist in document fabrication nearly $20,000 to create something that would pass casual inspection while remaining completely worthless in any legal sense. After the honeymoon, Rhett would manufacture a crisis. He had already planned several possible scenarios, each one designed to make Willow seem like the problem while positioning himself as the reluctant victim of circumstances beyond his control. Perhaps he would claim to have discovered something unforgivable about her past, some fabricated transgression that made continued marriage impossible. Perhaps he would simply announce that he had made a terrible mistake, that the pressure of the wedding had revealed fundamental incompatibilities he hadn't recognized during their courtship. Perhaps he would engineer a situation where she appeared to be unfaithful, using hired actors and carefully staged photographs to create evidence of betrayal that didn't exist. The details didn't ultimately matter. What mattered was that the photographs of the ceremony would satisfy his father's lawyers, creating documentation of a wedding that appeared completely legitimate. The trust money would be released based on those photographs and the accompanying paperwork, and Willow Holmes would be discarded with nothing but a broken heart, a stack of wedding photos documenting a marriage that never legally existed, and the slowly dawning realization that she had been used by a man who had never loved her for a single moment. Rhett smiled at his reflection, admiring the way his carefully maintained tan complemented the white of his dress shirt. He had spent 2 weeks at a private resort in the Caribbean preparing for this day, not out of any romantic notion about honeymoon preparation, but because he wanted to look his absolute best for the photographs that would unlock his inheritance. His phone buzzed on the dressing table, the sound cutting through his self-congratulation with unexpected sharpness. Rhett glanced at the screen expecting a message from Killian Chase, his best man and oldest friend from prep school, confirming that everything was proceeding according to schedule. Killian had been given specific responsibilities for the day, most of which involved keeping the various moving pieces of the scheme, operating smoothly while appearing to fulfill traditional best man duties. Instead, Rhett found a text from an unknown number, the digits unfamiliar and carrying no identifying information. "Does Willow know about Catalina?" The smile vanished from Rhett's face like water evaporating from hot pavement. He stared at the screen, his fingers suddenly cold around the crystal glass that had felt so comfortable just moments before. Catalina Lopez was his real relationship, the woman he had been seeing for 3 years, the woman who understood who he truly was and accepted him anyway. She was currently 4 months pregnant with his child and waiting in a luxury Manhattan apartment for Rhett to complete this charade and return to her waiting arms. Nobody knew about Catalina. Rhett had been meticulous about keeping the relationship hidden, understanding from the beginning that any connection between them could jeopardize his elaborate scheme. He used burner phones that he replaced monthly to communicate with her. He paid for everything in cash, leaving no credit card trail that investigators might follow. He booked hotels that catered specifically to wealthy men with secrets to protect, establishments where discretion was not just valued, but guaranteed. He had constructed an elaborate system of lies and precautions specifically designed to keep Catalina's existence invisible to anyone who might be watching his life. Nobody knew. His phone buzzed again, the vibration feeling almost aggressive against the polished wood of the dressing table. Room 247 at the Grandview Hotel, March 15th, March 22nd, April 3rd, April 17th. Should I continue? Rhett's hand trembled as he typed a response, his fingers clumsy on the screen in a way they had never been before. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly, as though the sender had been waiting with their response already composed. "Someone who knows everything." Then the phone went silent, the screen returning to its default display as though nothing unusual had occurred. Rhett stood frozen in the groom's suite, his mind racing through possibilities with increasing desperation. Catalina wouldn't expose him. She had too much to lose, including the lifestyle he provided and the future they had planned together. His friends didn't know about the relationship because he had never trusted any of them with information that valuable. His family certainly didn't know, and even if they suspected something, they lacked the motivation to investigate given their own complicated relationship with truth and transparency. The hotel staff were professionals who valued discretion above everything, understanding that their livelihoods depended on protecting the secrets of wealthy guests. Rhett had tipped generously and consistently, building relationships with key employees who understood that his privacy was worth protecting. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been gathering evidence with patience and precision. Someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, his wedding day, to reveal that they held the power to destroy everything he had built. But who possessed both the motivation and the capability to conduct such surveillance? A knock on the door made Rhett jump violently, his startled movement sloshing scotch across his pristine white shirt in an amber wave that spread like a stain of guilt across the expensive fabric. "Rhett, you okay in there?" Killian Chase's voice carried through the heavy oak door, casual and unconcerned. "Ceremony starts in 30 minutes. Your bride is getting anxious." Rhett stared at the spreading stain on his shirt, watching the amber liquid seep into the expensive fabric like blood from an invisible wound. The metaphor was not lost on him, even in his current state of growing panic. "I need a new shirt," he called back, fighting to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Give me 10 minutes, everything is fine." He heard Killian's footsteps retreat down the hallway, the sound fading into the ambient noise of wedding preparation happening throughout the venue. Once he was certain he was alone again, Rhett immediately pulled up the unknown number and tried to call it back. The line was disconnected, a mechanical voice informing him that the number he had dialed was not in service. He tried again, his fingers stabbing at the screen with increasing desperation. Same result. The number existed only long enough to deliver its poisonous messages before vanishing into digital nothingness. Whoever had sent those messages had disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving nothing but fear and confusion in their wake. Rhett changed his shirt with shaking hands, fumbling with buttons that he had fastened thousands of times before without difficulty. His mind cycled through everyone who might have discovered his secret, everyone who possessed both the means and the motive to conduct surveillance on a man of his wealth and status. The list was impossibly short, which only made the mystery more terrifying. He had been careful throughout his relationship with Catalina, treating the concealment of their connection as seriously as any business operation. He had been thorough in eliminating evidence and creating false trails. He had covered every track with the paranoid attention to detail that came from years of running schemes that skirted the edge of legality. But someone knew, and that someone had chosen his wedding day to announce their knowledge, timing the revelation for maximum psychological impact. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned, at least on the surface where the 300 guests could observe. Rhett walked down the aisle with the confident stride of a man in complete control, his smile never wavering, despite the cold fear coiling in his stomach like a venomous snake preparing to strike. The new shirt fit perfectly, and he had successfully convinced himself that the mysterious messages were merely a minor complication rather than an existential threat. He watched Willow approach in her designer gown, a creation that had cost nearly $40,000 and transformed her from merely pretty into genuinely beautiful. Her face was radiant with joy and hope, and all the beautiful emotions he had deliberately manufactured over 22 months of careful manipulation. She floated toward him on her father's arm, her eyes locked on his face with an expression of pure adoration that should have made him feel something other than satisfaction at a scheme proceeding according to plan. George Preston walked beside his daughter with the careful steps of a man uncomfortable in formal settings, his rented tuxedo fitting awkwardly on a frame built for work rather than ceremony. The older man was small and unremarkable, barely 5'8", with calloused hands that betrayed decades of manual labor and a weathered face that spoke of too many hours under harsh sun. Rhett had never paid much attention to Willow's father during their engagement, viewing him as an irrelevant background figure who would fade entirely from significance once the scheme reached completion. George Preston ran a small construction company that barely kept the lights on, the kind of modest enterprise that wealthy men like Rhett acknowledged only when they needed something built or repaired. The man represented everything Rhett had been raised to dismiss: honest work, limited ambition, contentment with modest success. He was precisely the kind of person the Turner family had spent generations learning to exploit. George transferred his daughter's hand to Rhett's with the traditional gesture, but something in the older man's expression gave Rhett momentary pause. The look wasn't the expected mixture of pride and sadness that fathers typically displayed when giving away their daughters. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like patience. Then the moment passed, and the ceremony continued, and Rhett convinced himself that he was reading meaning into meaningless expressions because the mysterious messages had unsettled his normally unshakable confidence. The vows were spoken with practiced sincerity, Rhett delivering lines he had rehearsed dozens of times until they sounded spontaneous and heartfelt. The rings were exchanged, matching bands that had cost a fraction of what Rhett usually spent on jewelry, but that Willow had chosen herself, valuing sentiment over expense in a way that Rhett found both touching and pathetic. Gerald, the fake officiant, pronounced them husband and wife, with theatrical gravitas that would have earned him a standing ovation in any community theater production. His performance was flawless, every word and gesture conveying the authority of legitimate clergy, even though his only qualification was 3 years of drama classes and a mountain of gambling debt. Rhett kissed his bride while 300 guests applauded and cameras captured the moment from every possible angle. The photographs would be excellent, he knew. He had hired the best photographer in the city specifically to document this moment, understanding that the quality of the evidence would determine how smoothly his father's lawyers accepted the validity of the marriage. But throughout the ceremony, Rhett's eyes kept scanning the crowd, searching for someone who didn't belong. Someone watching with knowing eyes. Someone whose presence might explain the threatening messages that had shattered his composure just an hour earlier. He studied each face in the congregation, looking for tells that might identify the mysterious sender. The wedding planner seemed focused entirely on logistical concerns, her expression the professional mask of someone managing a complex event. The venue staff moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, invisible in the way that service workers always became invisible to people of Rhett's class. The guests themselves were a mixture of Willow's modest social circle and Rhett's more impressive collection of wealthy acquaintances. He examined each face, wondering which of them might harbor secrets about his own secret life. Then his eyes found George Preston again, seated in the front row beside his wife Frances. The older man was watching the ceremony with an unreadable expression, his weathered hands folded in his lap like he wasn't sure what to do with them in such elegant surroundings. Their eyes met briefly across the ceremony space, and something in George's expression made Rhett's stomach clench with unexpected force. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't the awe that Rhett expected from people of George's modest background when confronted with Turner family wealth. It wasn't even the protective concern of a father watching his daughter marry a man he didn't entirely trust. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like anticipation. Then, George's expression shifted into a pleasant smile, and he was applauding with everyone else, and the moment passed so quickly that Rhett almost convinced himself he had imagined the entire exchange. Almost. The reception began with champagne and canapés, and the performative socializing that Rhett had mastered before he could legally drink. He worked the room with practiced charm, moving from group to group with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire life navigating social situations designed to display wealth and status. He accepted congratulations with gracious humility that was entirely manufactured. He made small talk with guests whose names he would forget by morning. He played the role of devoted groom with the skill of someone who had been playing roles his entire life. But his phone kept buzzing in his pocket, each vibration sending a spike of adrenaline through his nervous system. The photographs are very clear. Hotel security cameras are so reliable these days. Rhett excused himself to the bathroom, locking the door behind him before reading the message. His reflection in the mirror looked pale, frightened, nothing like the confident predator who had begun this day certain of his own invincibility. He splashed cold water on his face and returned to the reception, forcing his expression back into its accustomed mask of charming indifference. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. Catalina looks beautiful in that blue dress, the one you bought her for her birthday last month. Rhett nearly dropped his champagne glass. The blue dress had been a private gift, purchased with cash from a boutique that didn't keep customer records. He had given it to Catalina during a weekend they spent together at a private residence, a location he had specifically chosen because it lacked the security cameras that hotels typically employed. Someone had been watching that weekend. Someone had been close enough to observe the gift, to note its color, and the occasion of its giving. The surveillance was more extensive than he had initially feared. He excused himself from conversations with increasing frequency, retreating to corners and alcoves where he could check his phone without being observed. Each message ratcheted his anxiety higher, each revelation demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible to obtain. Did you know she's been talking to a lawyer about child support? Interesting timing. This message required a different kind of response. Rhett immediately texted Catalina on his burner phone, keeping the message casual despite his growing panic. Everything okay? Missing you. Her response came after an agonizing 3-minute delay. Fine, just tired. How's the charade going? Perfectly. Home soon. He stared at her response, searching for any indication that she had betrayed him to unknown parties. But Catalina had always been practical about their arrangement, understanding that the wedding was merely a necessary step toward the future they had planned together. She had no reason to jeopardize that future by exposing his secrets, unless someone had offered her something more valuable than what Rhett provided. The thought planted itself in his mind like a poisonous seed, immediately beginning to grow and spread into dark speculation about everyone he had ever trusted. Someone was watching him. Someone in this very room was feeding information to whoever was orchestrating this psychological assault. Someone had penetrated the careful walls he had built around his secret life and was systematically demonstrating their ability to destroy everything. Rhett began studying the guests more carefully, looking for anyone behaving unusually. The wedding planner maintained her professional focus, directing staff and managing the endless details that kept the reception running smoothly. The catering team moved with choreographed efficiency, delivering food and drinks with invisible precision. The photographer continued capturing moments with artistic dedication that Rhett had specifically paid for. None of them displayed any indication of hidden agendas or secret knowledge. Then he noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. George Preston was missing from his table. Rhett scanned the ballroom frantically, his eyes moving from table to table with increasing desperation. Willow's father had been sitting with his wife Frances just minutes ago, engaged in quiet conversation while the reception swirled around them. But now his chair was empty, and Frances sat alone with an expression that seemed almost deliberately neutral. Where had George gone? And why did his absence feel so significant? Rhett's phone buzzed again, the timing feeling almost supernatural in its precision. The trust documents are fascinating reading. Does your father know you've been embezzling from the family accounts? This message hit different than the others, cutting through his anxiety to trigger something closer to genuine terror. Rhett felt his knees weaken, and he grabbed a nearby table for support, earning concerned glances from guests who assumed the groom had simply consumed too much champagne. The Catalina situation was embarrassing but potentially survivable. He could deny the relationship, claim the photographs were fabricated, use his family's legal resources to suppress any scandal that might emerge. The fake marriage was more complicated, but clever lawyers had constructed defenses for worse situations. But the embezzlement was different. The embezzlement was criminal. The embezzlement could send him to prison for years, while simultaneously destroying any hope of inheriting the family fortune. He had been skimming from various Turner family accounts for nearly 5 years, small amounts carefully calibrated to avoid triggering the automated alerts that monitored large transactions. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Money that disappeared into offshore accounts he controlled exclusively through a complex web of shell companies and false identities. The total had grown to nearly $2 million over 60 months of patient theft, money he had used to maintain his lifestyle between trust disbursements to keep Catalina comfortable in the manner she had grown accustomed to, and to fund various schemes and pleasures that he preferred to keep invisible to family oversight. Nobody knew about the embezzlement. The accountants he had bribed were bound by mutual self-interest to maintain their silence. The paper trail was buried beneath layers of corporate complexity that would require forensic experts years to fully unravel. But someone had unraveled it. Someone had followed threads that should have been impossible to follow. Someone had connected accounts that should have been unconnectable. Someone had built a case against him that reached far beyond romantic indiscretion into territory that could destroy his life completely. Rhett typed a response with trembling fingers. "What do you want? Money? How much?" The reply came after an agonizing 30-second pause. "I don't want your money. I want you to understand what's coming." "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching for a very long time. Someone who knows exactly what you planned for Willow. Someone who's going to make sure you experience exactly what you intended for her." Rhett stared at his phone, his mind racing through the implications of that message. This wasn't blackmail in any traditional sense. The sender wasn't demanding payment or threatening exposure in exchange for silence. They were announcing destruction, pure and simple. They wanted him to suffer, and they wanted him to know it was coming before it arrived. Rhett moved through the crowd with new urgency, searching for George Preston with a focus that bordered on desperation. He checked the terrace, the gardens, the various alcoves and corners where guests had retreated for private conversations. The older man had vanished completely, as though he had never existed. Finally, after nearly 15 minutes of searching, Rhett found Willow's father standing alone on the terrace overlooking the estate gardens. George held a glass of water in his calloused hand, his weathered face peaceful as he contemplated the manicured landscaping below. "Mr. Preston." Rhett approached with his most charming smile firmly in place, despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Taking a break from the festivities?" George turned slowly, his movements unhurried and deliberate. His weathered face revealed nothing of his inner thoughts, a blank canvas that could have concealed any emotion. "Beautiful evening," George said, his voice mild and conversational. "Thought I'd enjoy the air. It gets crowded in there." "Of course." Rhett positioned himself beside Willow's father, studying the man with fresh attention that he had never bothered to apply before. "I wanted to thank you again for welcoming me into your family. I know this must be somewhat overwhelming, given the differences in our backgrounds." Something flickered in George's eyes, there and gone so quickly that Rhett almost missed it entirely. "Differences," George repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Yes, I suppose there are differences between us. I hope you know that I love your daughter more than anything in this world. I intend to spend the rest of my life making her happy, giving her everything she deserves." George took a slow sip of his water, his eyes never leaving Rhett's face. The silence stretched between them, comfortable for George and increasingly uncomfortable for Rhett. "My daughter is a good person," George finally said. "Kind, trusting. She sees the best in people, even when maybe she shouldn't, even when the evidence suggests that the best isn't really there. Those are wonderful qualities for a wife to possess. They can also be dangerous qualities." George's voice remained conversational, almost gentle, but something beneath the words made Rhett's skin crawl with undefined unease. A trusting person can be taken advantage of by someone less scrupulous, someone who sees kindness as weakness rather than strength. Rhett forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Are you warning me about someone, Mr. Preston? Someone I should be protecting Willow from?" George smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret, someone who was enjoying a private joke at another person's expense. "Just making an observation about human nature. I've had 40 years to study how people behave when they think nobody's watching." He paused, taking another slow sip of water. "You learn a lot about character by observing what people do when they believe they're invisible." The words landed like physical blows, each one carrying implications that Rhett couldn't quite dismiss. "I should get back to my wife," George continued, setting his water glass on the terrace railing. "She worries when I disappear for too long. 40 years of marriage, and she still wants to know where I am at every moment." He walked past Rhett without another word, his footsteps steady and unhurried on the stone terrace. The younger man stood frozen, watching George Preston's retreating figure with a growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The next message arrived before George had even reached the ballroom doors. "He knows everything. He's known for 6 months. Did you really think a man who's survived 40 years in construction wouldn't know how to investigate someone threatening his daughter?" Rhett stared at his phone, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity that made his head spin. George Preston. The quiet, unassuming man in the rented tuxedo. The father who barely spoke during family dinners, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by unfamiliar social situations, who appeared completely out of his depth in the world of wealth and status that Rhett inhabited. It had all been an act. Every stammered response, every uncomfortable silence, every moment of apparent intimidation, all of it had been carefully calculated performance. George had been investigating Rhett for 6 months, gathering evidence with patient determination, while pretending to be nothing more than a simple contractor who couldn't quite understand his daughter's good fortune. He had assembled a case powerful enough to destroy everything while sitting at dinner tables and making small talk about weather and construction projects. But why hadn't he done anything with that evidence? Why had he allowed the wedding to proceed, watching his daughter marry a man he knew to be a predator? Why was he calmly attending a reception, celebrating a marriage he knew to be fraudulent? The answer came with the next message, and it made Rhett's blood run cold. He wanted you to feel safe. He wanted you to commit fully to your scheme, to document everything with photographs and witnesses. He wanted 300 people watching when the truth came out. He wanted everyone you know to see exactly who you really are. Rhett's hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped his phone. The screen blurred before his eyes, and he realized with distant surprise that he was crying, though whether from fear or rage he couldn't determine. What does he want from me? There has to be something. Everyone wants something. The response took longer this time, nearly a full minute of agonizing silence during which Rhett aged what felt like years. He wants you to understand what it feels like to have everything taken away. He wants you to experience the humiliation you planned for his daughter. He wants you to know that you were never the predator in this situation, no matter what you believed. You were always the prey. From the very first moment you targeted Willow, you were walking into a trap you couldn't see. Rhett looked through the terrace doors at the glittering reception, at the 300 guests enjoying food and champagne and music, at the elaborate celebration of a marriage that existed only in carefully constructed photographs. He found George Preston in the crowd, standing beside his wife at their table. As though sensing Rhett's attention, the older man turned and looked directly at him through the glass doors. Their eyes locked across the crowded space, and George raised his water glass in a small, mocking toast. The gesture was subtle enough that no one else would have noticed it, but to Rhett, it felt like a declaration of war. Then George set down his glass and began walking toward the center of the room. Rhett watched in frozen horror as George intercepted the band leader and spoke quietly into his ear. The music stopped mid-song, the sudden silence jarring after hours of continuous melody. Conversations died throughout the ballroom as guests turned toward the unexpected interruption, their faces curious rather than concerned. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." George's voice carried across the ballroom with surprising authority, projecting clearly without shouting. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter's wedding." Willow appeared beside Rhett, having crossed the terrace while he stood paralyzed by approaching doom. Her face glowed with happiness and champagne-fueled joy. "Daddy's giving a speech," she exclaimed, her voice bright with surprised pleasure. "I didn't know he had prepared anything. He hates public speaking." Rhett couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only watch through the glass doors as the destruction he had planned for Willow was redirected toward him with surgical precision. He should run. He should disappear through the gardens and vanish into the night before whatever was coming could arrive. He should take whatever money he had immediately accessible and flee to a country without extradition treaties. But his legs refused to move, and some part of him needed to witness what happened next, needed to understand exactly how completely he had been outmaneuvered by a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. George waited until he had the complete attention of every person in the room, his weathered face patient and calm. "I've spent 40 years working in construction," he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "Building things with my hands, learning to read blueprints and budgets, and, most importantly, people. You can't survive 4 decades in this business without learning to recognize when someone is lying to you, when the foundation isn't solid, when the structure is going to collapse." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some guests smiled, expecting a humorous speech about fathers giving away daughters and the challenges of welcoming new sons into families. George didn't smile. "When my daughter brought Rhett home to meet us 18 months ago, I have to admit I was skeptical. A wealthy man from a powerful family, interested in my Willow? It seemed too good to be true. It seemed like the kind of thing that happens in movies rather than real life." The laughter died as guests sensed the shift in George's tone. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. "So I did what any protective father would do when faced with a situation that didn't feel quite right. I asked some questions, made some inquiries, talked to some people who know how to find information that others want desperately to keep hidden." Complete silence now. Every eye was fixed on the small man in the ill-fitting tuxedo, every ear straining to catch his next words. George reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope that had been concealed against his body throughout the evening. "What I found was disturbing enough that I spent the next 6 months confirming every detail, building a case that couldn't be disputed or dismissed or explained away by expensive lawyers." He paused, his eyes finding Rhett through the glass doors. "Rhett McMillan has been maintaining a romantic relationship with another woman throughout his entire engagement to my daughter. Her name is Catalina Lopez. She is currently 4 months pregnant with his child." The gasps that erupted threatened to crack the chandeliers. Guests surged to their feet, looking around the room for Rhett, searching for the groom who stood frozen on the terrace while his carefully constructed world collapsed. "That's a lie!" Rhett finally found his voice, pushing through the terrace doors into the ballroom. "This man is clearly disturbed. He's been drinking. He's making up stories because he never thought I was good enough for his precious daughter." George turned to face him with an expression of absolute calm that was more terrifying than any anger could have been. I have photographs. I have hotel receipts. I have testimony from 4 of your household staff members who witnessed Catalina visiting your apartment on numerous occasions. He held up the envelope. I have documentation of monthly payments to an account in her name, totaling nearly $200,000 over the past 3 years. I have medical records confirming her pregnancy and your paternity. Rhett opened his mouth to respond, but George wasn't finished. Additionally, the man standing before you as my daughter's husband is not actually her husband. The officiant who performed today's ceremony is an actor named Gerald Hoffman, currently wanted in 2 states for fraud. The marriage license Willow signed is a forgery created by a specialist in document fabrication who has already provided a full confession in exchange for reduced charges. The gasps became shouts of confusion and outrage. Guests surged toward Rhett, their faces transformed from celebration to condemnation in the space of seconds. These were people who had congratulated him just hours ago, who had shaken his hand and wished him well, and now they looked at him like he was something discovered beneath a rock. But there's more. George's voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority that somehow silenced the growing pandemonium. Rhett has been embezzling from his family's accounts for nearly 5 years. I have documentation showing over $2 million diverted to offshore accounts in his name through a network of shell companies designed to obscure the theft. George reached into the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. His father, Vance Turner, received copies of this evidence at 9 o'clock this morning. I spoke with him personally at 11. Mr. Turner asked me to inform his son that all access to family accounts has been suspended pending a full criminal investigation. Rhett felt the room spinning around him. His vision blurred. His legs threatened to give way beneath the weight of his collapsing empire. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. "You can't just destroy everything I've built." George walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate and measured, until barely 3 feet separated the hunter from his prey. "You destroyed yourself," George said quietly, his voice carrying only to Rhett. "You made choices that led you here. You targeted my daughter because you thought she was weak, because you thought her family was too poor and too simple to pose any threat. You looked at us and saw marks, easy targets, people so far beneath you that we wouldn't even notice we were being robbed." He stepped closer, and Rhett found himself retreating despite being half a foot taller and decades younger than the weathered contractor facing him. "You never considered that a man who spent 40 years building things might also know how to tear them down. You never imagined that someone like me might have connections, resources, capabilities that don't show up in bank statements or social registers." George's voice dropped even lower, becoming almost intimate. "I've dealt with men like you my entire career. Rich men who think money makes them superior. Powerful men who believe they can take whatever they want from whoever they want. They always underestimate the people they consider beneath them. They always assume that wealth and breeding and expensive education make them untouchable." He smiled, and it was the coldest expression Rhett had ever seen on a human face. "They're always wrong." Security guards appeared at the ballroom entrance, summoned by the wedding planner who had been watching the drama unfold with undisguised horror. They approached Rhett with professional determination, their faces carefully neutral despite the extraordinary circumstances. "These gentlemen will escort you from the premises," George announced, his voice rising to address the entire room once again. "The police are waiting outside to discuss the forgery charges. Federal investigators will want to talk to you about the embezzlement, and I'm told that Catalina Lopez has already been contacted by a family law attorney who specializes in child support and custody cases involving wealthy defendants." Rhett tried to speak, to defend himself, to find some angle that might salvage the situation. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing. No wealth to leverage since his accounts were frozen. No connections to exploit since his family had abandoned him. No scheme clever enough to escape the trap that had been closing around him for 6 months while he remained blissfully unaware of its existence. How? He finally managed, the single word containing all of his confusion and despair. How did you know? How did you do any of this? George straightened his ill-fitting jacket with quiet dignity, a gesture that somehow transformed him from a small man in borrowed clothes to something far more imposing. The first time you shook my hand, you looked at me like I was beneath you, like I was something to be tolerated rather than respected, like my entire life of honest work and fair dealing was worthless compared to the money you inherited without earning. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've spent 40 years learning to read people, Mr. Macmillan. Learning to recognize when a foundation is rotten, when a structure is going to collapse, when someone is lying to me about the quality of their materials. You thought you were fooling everyone with your charm and your smile and your expensive clothes. George shook his head slowly. You never fooled me, not for a single moment. The security guards reached Rhett and took his arms with firm grips that left no room for resistance. One more thing, George called as they began leading the younger man toward the exit. My pathetic little construction company has been handling renovation contracts for 3 of your father's commercial properties for the past 8 years. We do excellent work, very thorough, very detail-oriented, very good at noticing things that other people miss. He smiled. Those skills translate surprisingly well to investigation. Rhett was escorted from the ballroom, his expensive tuxedo suddenly feeling like a prison uniform, his confident facade shattered beyond any possibility of repair. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was George Preston embracing his daughter, his weathered hands gentle on her shaking shoulders as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. The man Rhett had dismissed as a nobody had destroyed him completely, and Rhett had never seen it coming until it was far too late to matter. 3 hours later, the ballroom had transformed from a crime scene into something unexpected and beautiful. The shock had faded into something more complex, a mixture of relief and celebration and the strange energy that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. The tears had dried on faces that now wore expressions of wonder rather than horror. And George Preston had made an announcement that surprised everyone still present. We paid for this party, he said, addressing the remaining guests with a warmth that had been absent during his confrontation with Rhett. We have 300 guests, excellent food, a talented band, and a room full of people who just witnessed something they'll never forget. I say we celebrate. The band struck up a lively tune, choosing something upbeat and joyful that seemed to banish the tension that had hung over the room. The champagne continued flowing, and gradually the guests began to smile, to laugh, to dance as though the evening's drama had been entertainment rather than tragedy. Willow found her father on the terrace where he had confronted Rhett hours earlier. The night had grown cold, a chill wind carrying the promise of autumn, but neither of them seemed to notice or care. How long did you know? She asked, her voice steady despite everything she had learned about the man she thought she loved. I started investigating 3 weeks after you brought him home for that first dinner. That was almost 2 years ago. You've been watching him for almost 2 years. George nodded slowly, his weathered face peaceful in the soft light from the ballroom windows. I had to be certain before I acted. I had to build a case so complete, so comprehensive, that there would be no room for doubt, no angle he could exploit, no way for expensive lawyers to dismiss the evidence or explain away the accusations. Why didn't you tell me what you were finding? Why did you let me plan this wedding, spend all this money, invite all these people to celebrate something you knew was a fraud?" George turned to face his daughter, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because you loved him, Mija. Because you were happy, genuinely happy, for the first time since your divorce. Because I knew that telling you wouldn't be enough to break his hold on you." He took her hands in his calloused grip, the hands that had built houses and repaired machines and held her when she was a frightened child. "You had to see who he really was. You had to watch him reveal himself in front of everyone you know. Otherwise, you might have spent the rest of your life wondering if I had been wrong about him, if I had destroyed something real because of my own suspicions and prejudices." Willow was silent for a long moment, processing everything that had happened, everything that had been revealed, everything that her father had done to protect her from a predator she had welcomed into her life. "He was going to throw me away," she finally said. "Like garbage, like I meant nothing." "Yes. He was going to humiliate me and discard me, and I would have believed it was my fault. I would have believed I had done something wrong, that I wasn't good enough, that I had failed somehow." "Yes. And you let the wedding happen anyway, knowing all of this, so that you could do to him exactly what he planned to do to me." George's expression hardened into something that might have frightened Willow if she didn't understand the love behind it. "I let the wedding happen so that 300 witnesses could see exactly what kind of man Rhett McMillan truly is. I let the wedding happen so that when the police arrested him, when the investigators questioned him, when the lawyers destroyed what remained of his privileged life, there would be no ambiguity about what he had intended." He squeezed her hands gently. "You were never in danger of being legally married to that monster. I made sure of that months ago. The fake officiant was my discovery, not his plan. I just let him believe he was in control, that his scheme was proceeding exactly as he intended, while I assembled the evidence that would destroy him." Willow stared at her father with new understanding, seeing him for the first time not just as the kind man who had raised her, but as someone capable of patient, calculated revenge. "You played him. I outworked him. I outplanned him. I out-everythinged him." George's voice was fierce with protective love. He thought he was the smartest person in any room. He thought his money and his breeding and his Ivy League education made him superior to everyone around him. He never imagined that a small-time contractor from nowhere could dismantle his entire life piece by piece over 6 months of patient investigation. "Daddy," Willow's voice cracked with emotion, "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. When you tried to ask questions about him, when you seemed uncomfortable at family dinners, I thought you were just being overprotective. I thought you couldn't accept that your little girl was growing up and making her own choices. I was being overprotective. That's what fathers do. That's what fathers are supposed to do." George pulled her into a hug, his arms tight around her shoulders. "But I was also being patient, because I knew that eventually the truth would come out, and I wanted to make sure that when it did, you would be protected, you would be safe, you would walk away with your dignity intact, while he lost everything." They held each other on the terrace while the party continued inside, music and laughter drifting through the open doors, the sounds of celebration that had nothing to do with a wedding and everything to do with justice being served. "What happens now?" Willow finally asked, pulling back to look at her father's face. Now Rhett faces consequences for the first time in his privileged life. The embezzlement charges alone could mean years in federal prison. The forgery adds more. And his father has made it very clear that there will be no family resources available for his defense. Vance Turner is apparently a ruthless man when it comes to protecting his assets, and an embezzling son is a liability he's not willing to protect. What about Catalina? What about the baby? She's a victim too, in her own way. Rhett lied to her, just like he lied to you. She believed she was his real relationship, that you were just a temporary obstacle to his inheritance that he was tolerating until he could claim his money and return to her. George's voice softened with something approaching sympathy. My lawyer is helping her understand her options. The child deserves support, regardless of who the father turns out to be. No baby should suffer for the sins of its parents. Willow pulled back to look at her father's face, studying the weathered features that had been a constant presence throughout her entire life. You've been planning this for almost 2 years. 2 years of watching, investigating, building a case. 2 years of sitting at dinner tables and making small talk while you knew exactly what he was planning to do. To me. George nodded slowly. The hardest part was watching you fall deeper in love with him, watching you plan the wedding, pick out flowers and invitations, and choose the dress you would wear when you married a man who intended to destroy you. How did you do it? How did you sit through all of those dinners without saying anything? Because I kept my eyes on the goal, because I knew that the more complete his scheme became, the more devastating its collapse would be. Because I understood that patience is sometimes the most powerful weapon available. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. And because I love you more than anything in this world, Misha, more than my pride, more than my need to protect you immediately, more than my desire to spare you pain. George's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I let you hurt because I knew the alternative was worse. I let you plan a wedding to a monster because I knew the only way to truly free you was to let you see his true face with your own eyes, in front of everyone you know, in a way that could never be denied or explained away. Willow felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Misha. George smiled back, and this time the expression was warm and genuine and exactly what she needed to see. Now let's go back inside. They're about to cut the cake, and I didn't spend $14,000 on that monstrosity to let it go to waste. The party lasted until well past midnight, long after most wedding receptions would have ended. By the time the last guests departed, full of champagne and stories and the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary, Rhett McMillan had been processed through the county jail, denied bail due to flight risk, and abandoned by every person he had ever considered a friend or ally. His father released a statement to the press expressing shock and disappointment at the revelations about his son's behavior, carefully distancing the Turner family name from the scandal that was already spreading across social media. His mother, reaching out from her villa in the south of France, refused to take his calls. Killian Chase, his supposed best friend since prep school, had provided a comprehensive statement to investigators detailing everything he knew about Rhett's various schemes over the years. The man who had walked into the Hartwell estate convinced of his own invincibility walked out in handcuffs, his empire reduced to ashes by a small-time contractor who had never been noticed until it was far too late. 6 months later, after a trial that captured national attention, Rhett pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. The embezzlement money was recovered and returned to his family. The forgery charges resulted in additional probation that would extend years beyond his prison term. Catalina Lopez gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom she named Sophia. She received a substantial child support settlement from the Turner Family Trust, enough to ensure that her daughter would never want for anything material. She declined all of Rhett's attempts at contact, building a new life that had no place in it for the man who had deceived her. And Willow Holmes returned to her work at St. Michael's Hospital, holding the hands of sick children and comforting their families through impossible moments. She started a support group for people who had escaped manipulative relationships, sharing her story to help others recognize the warning signs she had missed. George Preston continued running his construction company, though he took on fewer projects now, preferring to spend time with his wife Frances, traveling to places they had always dreamed of visiting, building memories instead of buildings. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit on his porch and think about the months he had spent hunting Rhett McMillan. The surveillance, the documentation, the careful assembly of evidence that would guarantee complete destruction. He had discovered capabilities within himself that surprised him, patience that bordered on obsession, ruthlessness that would have horrified his younger self, a willingness to become something darker in service of protecting someone he loved. The experience had changed him in ways he was still processing. He had won. He had protected his daughter. He had delivered justice that the legal system might never have provided on its own. But he had also glimpsed something inside himself that he hadn't known existed, a capacity for calculated destruction that rivaled anything Rhett McMillan had possessed. Frances joined him on the porch one evening, settling into the chair beside his with the easy comfort of 40 years of marriage. "You're thinking about it again." "Always, at this time of night." "Do you regret what you did?" George considered the question carefully, turning it over in his mind like a stone he had examined thousands of times without ever fully understanding. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that men like Rhett exist in this world, that they prey on good people, that they treat kindness as weakness and trust as something to be exploited." He paused, staring at the stars overhead. "But I don't regret protecting Willow. I don't regret exposing him for what he was, and I don't regret ensuring that he can never do to another family what he tried to do to ours." Frances reached over and took his weathered hand in her own. "Then let it go. You did what you had to do. Now it's time to live the rest of our lives without carrying that weight." George squeezed her hand gently. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise, George Preston. You were just too busy building things to notice." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. The night was cool and clear, the kind of evening that reminded George why he had spent his whole life working with his hands, creating things that would outlast him. He had built a house for his family. He had built a business that employed good people and served its community with integrity. He had built a reputation based on honest work and fair dealing and keeping his word no matter the cost. And when necessary, he had built a trap so perfect that his daughter's predator had walked into it without ever realizing he was prey. Some constructions were made of wood and stone and steel. Others were made of patience and evidence and righteous fury. George Preston was good at building both.